President Biden has announced an additional $800 million in security assistance to Ukraine. Meanwhile, with inflation in the U.S. hitting new 40-year highs, the Fed has approved its first interest rate hike in more than 3 years. And with the war in Ukraine now in its third week, the war of words between world leaders has escalated significantly, with President Biden calling Russia's President Vladimir Putin a war criminal. And U.S. Secretary of State Blinken echoing that, also calling Putin a war criminal. Well, my next guest is calling Putin the new coronavirus. Former Texas Congressman Dr. Ron Paul says President Biden, Congress, and the Fed are using the Ukraine-Russia conflict as a ready-made excuse for their failures. Dr. Paul is also the host of the Liberty Report. Dr. Paul, thank you so much for joining us again on Kitco.
Thank you very much. It's real nice to be with you.
All right, Dr. Paul, in your latest column, you said that Putin and the conflict in Ukraine are being used for further expansion of government power, and you called Putin the new coronavirus. Elaborate on what you mean by that.
Well, I hope that wasn't too strong, but now that's interesting because I see an analogy there, because I believe that the people have to endorse the insanities of Washington. They have to be badgered into it. They mostly have to be frightened. Fear has to exist. And that happened with the coronavirus. I'm working on the assumption that since 2008, we really never cleansed the economy a bit. And we just did QEs, and everybody seemed to adapt to it, sort of an addiction that they liked. But everybody knew it was going to start, the economy would slow up. And, a couple of years ago, before coronavirus hit, I think it was obvious that the correction was pushing itself into the headlines, which is a natural thing when they monetize too much debt and print too much money and mess around with interest rates. So that was evidence. And it just seemed like that virus was so convenient. I don't think the money managers manufactured the coronavirus, although there's been the accusations that other nefarious individuals have messed around with creating this virus. Anyway, the event occurred, and it fell into place because it was something that, could build up a lot of fear and an excuse for spending money. So the bailouts that were going on in the early part of this century, as well as after 08 and QE, that was nothing compared to what they did after the fear mongering occurred with coronavirus and all those checks went out. I mean, it wasn't like millions or billions, it was trillions of dollars they passed out. So they were really resorting to the inflation or to the condition. So that was easy to do for a couple of years, but then it started to wane because people were starting to hit, I think that, including myself, I think that whole thing on the coronavirus was overblown and exaggerated and used as a tool to prop up the economy. And that's up for grabs on if anybody agrees with me or that or not. But they did get into the business of messing around with a lot more money. But then again, as the virus was receding, they still had to have an enemy. And they had to have an excuse, and there's always a smoldering foreign policy excuse. If they don't find it in Ukraine, they might find it dealing with China or somebody. But that's a good way to spend a lot of money. Americans say you've got to have national defense, and believe me, it's bipartisan. They always complain there's not enough partisanship in Washington. There's plenty when it comes to spending, whether it's coronavirus or for military thing. So the fear mongering occurred over Ukraine, and the spending continued, and it's still going on because nobody knows when that's going to end, and it's a mess, and it's very expensive.
Very expensive. And as I mentioned, more aid has been approved with bipartisan support. The U.S. sending further security assistance and military equipment, and that was largely in response to a plea by Ukraine's President Zelensky. He gave a virtual address to Congress on Wednesday telling U.S. lawmakers, and I quote, "We need you right now." Zelensky spoke very passionately, and he invoked tragedies in American history like the attack on Pearl Harbor and the September 11th terrorist attack. He showed footage of Russian bombing civilian targets. And Zelensky, as we know, is calling for more help. He's calling for a no-fly zone. He's calling for more missile defense systems and more aid. And look, Dr. Paul, there's clearly a crisis here. Russia has reportedly bombed civilians indiscriminately. The United Nations says there's a refugee crisis. At least 3 million Ukrainians have been forced to flee. So, Dr. Paul, what should, in your opinion, the U.S. be doing now?
Packing up and come home. That's what we need to be. We should never have been in there if we'd have had a constitutional non-interventionist foreign policy.
Well, we're not in Ukraine. We haven't sent troops to Ukraine.
Well, we essentially do it, but we hide it. We send the advisors. I think most of the killing is involved, especially on the Ukrainians have a lot of our weapons, and this $800 billion, is American money going into that battle. So we're very, very much involved. And I just think that, I think one of the most important events leading up to the crisis that we have now was the coup in 2014. That the evidence is overwhelming that we participated in this coup in order to get rid of the leader that was somewhat fair and balanced in treating the Russians. So that has occurred. And since then, we have been spending a lot of money. We've been having training groups. The CIA now admits that they've been in there ever since 2014, training people to be prepared for this war that they assume would come.
Well, to your point, the U.S. has been financing weapons, sending more arms, including anti-aircraft systems, drones, and reportedly the U.S. has assisted in military training. Now, while there are no U.S. troops on the ground in Ukraine, certainly not at the moment, the American military presence in the area has been bolstered in surrounding NATO countries. Now, of course, the U.S. has also imposed severe sanctions on Russia. But are you saying that you don't think the U.S. should be involved at all? Because President Zelensky made a very strong cry for help with his speech to Congress. He referenced World War II, for example. He even addressed President Biden directly, saying to him in English, and I'm quoting here, "I wish you to be the leader of the world." Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace. So is that the role of the U.S.? Does the U.S. not have some kind of moral obligation to intervene?
Well, if they do, the American citizen can do what he wants. Some of them packed their bags and went over there and took a rifle and started fighting for him. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says that arbitrarily we can get involved in foreign conflicts without declaration of war and at times use a draft to send kids over there, or all the time take money from you. And if you don't have enough money in your bank account that they can tax, then they'll just print the money and give us this economic system we have. We don't have the money. That's one thing, but I don't think we have the moral authority to do it too. This whole idea that giving more money and guns to the Ukrainians is a morally correct position. I think minding our own business is a morally correct position, with the right of individuals who can voluntarily participate in whatever they want to do.
So to be clear, you don't think the U.S. should be involved in this in any way or shape whatsoever, including sending the military aid that it sent? You think that the U.S. should just be completely hands off in this conflict, even if we're seeing civilians being targeted indiscriminately?
Well, which sides are doing what? They're both killing each other. No, I don't think we should send them any money. It's not anybody's money. I mean, why do we have this right to send money and kids over there to get involved in a war? How's this going to help us? It's just going to aggravate things. See, because some of the hawks now say, "Oh, well, we need now. You're a bunch of wimps. You need a no-fly zone." And some people predict, now, if you're really worrying about confrontation with nuclear weapons, that's what you do. You design a no-fly zone that's going to involve shooting down Russian airplanes. So we need to stay out of it. It doesn't serve our interest to do that. I feel less secure by them doing this. And besides, we don't have any money, and they don't have the legal constitutional authority to do this. We're not the policemen of the world. And many presidents, including George Bush, ran on that. On a non-intervention policy. We're not the policemen of the world, and we don't have the money to do this. But they talk a good game, and then they come along, and the deep state, the military-industrial complex, puts tremendous pressure on those in office. So I think the same thing is happening here, that right now people complain Biden is too weak, but the people behind him aren't too weak, and they get the policy that they want. And that means that we will stay engaged. And what would be so terrible? How many conflicts are going on around the world right now? You probably could find 20 or 30, and we can't do it. We shouldn't do it, and it doesn't enhance peace. This was the argument when I was in high school why we had to be in Korea, and then there was Vietnam during the 60s when I got drafted. It was always these noble ideas. Well, it's our moral duty to do this. Innocent people are dying. So what they do is they devise a system where more innocent people die, and they expand the war. And I think non-intervention means that these problems that they have, how would we help them? There's a very good way. If I had a wand, I'd wave a wand and make them all believers in the gold standard and free market economies, go back to work, no regulations unless those are cheating people, and no counterfeiting money. You go back to work and keep what you earn. Now that would be doing something for them. The spreading the message of liberty is really what we ought to be involved in, and that even should be done voluntarily.
All right, so to be clear, you do not believe that the U.S. should be involved in this conflict. You do not think that the U.S. should be the policeman of the world, as you said, and shouldn't even be helping in terms of sending weapons. Now, you mentioned the no-fly zone. So far, that has been turned down by the U.S. and NATO because of the fear that this could escalate the conflict very quickly if the U.S. were to enforce that, or a NATO ally, and shoot down a Russian plane. But look, Dr. Paul, this conflict has been dragging on longer than Putin expected. We have British military intelligence saying that the invasion has largely stalled on all fronts, with forces suffering heavy losses and making minimal progress in recent days. It does seem to not be going according to Putin's plan, at least so far. Given we are where we are, and you don't have your magic wand to wave, but how do you see this playing out? How do you see this crisis getting resolved? Do you think there's a diplomatic off-ramp here, or do you foresee an even bigger military escalation?
No, I diplomatically, one thing I said in one of my campaigns is we have thousands of diplomats. So it's a shame we don't use them once in a while. Now, and under these conditions, with Biden calling Putin a war criminal, that doesn't go very far. And then we are stealing half of their capital reserves. We took most of them probably in dollars, and that's not going to work. And then when we give this money back that we confiscate from the various countries, like Iran or other countries, we give it back, and then some people in this country said, "Oh, you can't afford that. You can't tax American people to give them. It was their money. We stole it from them." So we just stole all this money from the Russians, and the Russians didn't declare war against us.
I do want to get to that. I certainly want to circle back to that and what this conflict means for the US dollar and the way it's been used as a political tool. But before we touch on that, I'm curious to see what insight you may have on how this thing gets resolved, how this thing comes to an end.
Well, I don't think anybody knows and can predict. It's not going to come to an end gracefully and soon. It's going to end when we're exhausted. It's sort of like asking me in 1962 when I was drafted, when is Vietnam going to end? And my answer is the same: when we're exhausted, and that means we're sick and tired of it. Vietnam ended terribly because we lost the war. They believed guns and butters would work. It didn't work. We had inflation of the 70s, and finally we just ran out of steam. And I think this is going to happen too, because we're building up our troops. We're expanding NATO's. I think NATO's the problem. If we really want to do something to try to speed it up, we need to teach the American people why we don't need to be in these entangling alliances. Robert Taft said, don't ever get in NATO or you'll be ending up in a war with Eastern Europe and with the Russians. So no, it's not going to it's not going to end soon with diplomacy. It's going to end in due time. And that's unpredictable too, because you don't know how people are going to react to the inflation. That can explode. You can go to total chaos in inflation if people panic. And with all these things going on, they could panic, and then the government's going to panic by cracking down on us. So just think of the stories now. What's it going to be like when the government denies all use of cash? And I'll tell you what, that's going to be really bad news. But then it's up to the American people. Now, how long was the attack on COVID going to last? How long were we going to have to put up with that nonsense? Until the people got sick of it. And finally, the people did, and the parents went to parent PTA meetings, and they spoke out, and truckers got out there. When the people get sick and tired of it, they have to do something. Most governments exist only when the people are passive and will go along with it, and they're not speaking out. Right now, when it comes to COVID, the people have spoken, and it's disappearing, the insanities of that enforcement.
Right.
And right now, we don't have Vietnam. We don't have any body bags. So people are going to put up with this until the money quits working. And that could be next year or the year after or the year after.
Well, the Biden administration has been using this conflict as a scapegoat for inflation, blaming inflation on Putin, although the Fed's own data showed inflation at a 40-year high well before this conflict even began. And Fed Chair Powell saying, however, that the Fed is still sticking to its tightening path, says the economy is strong and can withstand it. We did get a 25 basis point rate hike on Wednesday, and the Fed is saying it'll stay the course with 6 interest rate hikes this year. Do you see that happening?
No, it's not going to happen. That seems so silly. They worked for years and years begging and pleading with the market that we need 2% of inflation. We want to steal 2% of the value of your dollar every year. And that'll make a healthy economy. It's ridiculous. And that was their official policy. Now, I heard one official, it might have been Powell, he says, we need to work hard to get the inflation rate down to 2%. Which was my prediction. When it hits 2, you're not even going to notice. It went sailing through 2. And how many people really know what the real inflation rate is? Because only the housewife and the one who does the shopping knows. And the government admits to 7, and it could be 10 or 12. So the inflation is there, and that is going to help. That is the thing that will stop it. You can talk about the value of the dollar, even the price of gold, and all these things. But what will finally do it, where the people say enough is enough, is when the prices go up, and when prices double, people just have lost half of their wealth. And that's when the people might hopefully respond to our request. Start thinking about monetary policy. That's what you have to do. It's not a technical strategic management problem at the Fed. That's ridiculous. But this 25 basis points, that's as silly as making into the inflation deliberately 2%. And that is not going to work. It won't last. They tried it a couple years ago, and this one will last even less long, because they're talking about 5 times maybe this year. And look how long the debate went on, and the warnings and the conditioning of trying to get the financial community to accept 0.25 increase. That for me is a joke, and they're kidding themselves. And I don't know. I can't believe that the people who make money off this believe this stuff. What they have to do is sort it all out. Who's telling the lies and which lies will prevail, because it makes no economic sense on what they're doing.
Well, this is the same Fed that was trying to convince us that inflation was transitory. So I see why you have reason to be skeptical when the Fed says it's going to have at least 6 rate hikes this year. I want to touch on how this conflict impacts the dollar, because you did mention it. You did mention how it has been used as a political tool here. President Putin has been very vocal about how the U.S. has been freezing assets of Russia's central bank that have held in North America and in Europe. And he's saying that now everybody knows that financial reserves can, and I'm quoting him, simply be stolen. He says that it's illegitimate and that this is going to lead to countries around the world to now store their reserves in tangible assets such as gold, land, raw materials, instead of in financial assets. Now, whether it's right or wrong for the U.S. to do this is another conversation. But what do you think it means for how the dollar is viewed as a global reserve currency if it can and has been used as a political tool of coercion?
Well, it's going to get worse. That is, we will have less clout as issuing the reserve currency of the world. It's already started in that direction. It never deserved much credit for being a reserve currency, but it's just sort of accidental about how we came out of World War II. We weren't bombed to smithereens. We still had a lot of wealth. We had all the gold, and we had the directions, and we controlled the IMF and the World Bank, and established NATO, and that was our police force, and we've been running our empire that way. But people lost confidence in that system in 1971, and amazingly, with the crash of the Bretton Woods, gold did go, from $35 up to $800, and yet it survived it all. So yeah. It's pretty amazing to me. But the dollar right now is going to be under another attack. There's, the calculation on what they're doing in deciding what's going to happen, but there's also the subjectivity of it. The wealth of a country, how much peace is in the country. So other items help define the value of the currency. And but if you keep printing, it loses its value, and that's what's going to happen. I get the question asked so often. Okay, we'll talk about it politically and all the problems. So what should we? Oh, they want to know, when's it going to happen? When will the dollar crash and all this? Because on the international markets, the dollar still holds up because they're measuring against trash. Other currencies that print more than we print. So that doesn't work. The best way to measure it now, you look at the money supply and you say $6 trillion in 3 years of new money. That's a bad sign. But the sign that the people have totally caught on will be price inflation, the CPI and the PPI, and that's what is waking up the people. And then when they really panic, the people won't have any trouble. Let's hope that we come to our senses before we get as far as Zimbabwe and Venezuela. It's conceivable that even a great country like ours could get that far. It's happened before. Great countries have done this. But right now, the sign that people should be watching as far as the currency value goes is not the international exchange markets and some of those gimmicks they have. It should be price inflation.
Well, I get your point that the real issue is domestic, certainly in terms of what people need to be looking out for, because the dollar is still seen as a safety haven on the international market. But there's also a threat to the dollar potentially on the international scene when you consider this recent development of China having talks with Saudi Arabia to price some of its oil sales to China in yuan. And that's going to be a big blow to the petrodollar. It's going to hurt the dollar status as a global reserve currency. Now, reportedly, there have been talks with China over yuan-priced oil contracts on and off for 6 years. So it's not necessarily a new development, but we're getting the sense that it's accelerated this year because the Saudis have grown increasingly unhappy with the Biden administration, including this attempt to strike a deal with Iran over its nuclear program. at all costs. And the Saudis are reportedly not engaging with the Biden administration over requests for more oil output. Keeping in mind that China buys more than 25% of the oil that Saudi Arabia exports here, I'm curious what you think would happen to the dollar if this does go ahead. If you do now have oil priced in yuan, which would be a hit to the petrodollar, what could the ramifications of that be?
Well, I think you described, the weakening of the dollar already on the international exchange market. It is being used less, and I think our policies are prompting it to be used more and more. But to sit here and get out your computer and calculate this and say, at the rate we're doing this, in 6 months or 2 years, this thing is going to happen, and all of a sudden the Russians and the Chinese will have a reserve currency. I don't think it works that way. From my understanding of history, most of the reserve currencies disappear more gradually than that. It'll keep eroding. So maybe in a year or two from now, maybe we'll only have 40% of the marketplace. But if it gets to 40 and people panic in using it, and other conditions occur and the war is bigger, maybe it'll move more rapidly. But right now, I think under these circumstances, it's potential, but I don't think they're ready. I don't think if they decided, to survive, the Russians and the Chinese and the Indians get together and say, well, this is the new reserve currency, we're going to turn the switch and do it. I don't think it works that way. But I think gradualism is the way it is to condition people. And then if it has legs, then there might be a collapsing of it and a rapid change. But right now, I don't think we're there. But I certainly think that we are losing the status to a large degree, gradually and steadily, as a world reserve currency.
Losing the status, and then, of course, highlighting the issues with domestic mismanagement. And Dr. Paul, look, you've been saying this for several years. In 2007, before the financial crisis, you said the US is going broke, the dollar's being devalued, we're on the road to bankruptcy. And back then, the deficit was $9 trillion, which was pretty bad. But now it's $30 trillion. And it seems as though the crisis hasn't really hit yet. Stock market's still doing relatively well. So, and we have just come out of this global pandemic, and we now have this war in Eastern Europe. So what does it take? Not that I want it to happen, but what would it take for this crisis to actually explode?
Well, it's unknown, but there will be something that will precipitate, a close attention to this. It might be a number that comes out of the Fed that instead of the CPI saying, well, it's 7.5%, and when most people know it was over 10, and what happens if they admit that it was 15% and it was really 25%? Yes, I think that would be fireworks. Something will happen. People are poorer, no matter what they say. Everybody has a job and there's unemployment's real low and all, but people are poorer right now than they used to be. And the statistic I think is important is what percentage of people have enough income to survive for 1 year. And, a lot of people, just live from check to check and they have no savings. And the other thing is that there's not a good way to save. I remember in the 70s, when we had the crisis, interest rates went up, and you could get a CD and have 10% or more. But that's not the case. So even the average person, and I consider myself pretty average and old-fashioned, I think people should have a little money in the bank. But now the thing of it is, building up this fear is the confiscation of that or the closing down. Hopefully that's not getting close, but there are more talk about that than ever. If you have enough political chaos and disruption in the world, yes, they will freeze everything, and they're capable of doing it. Just think of how much control they have over our every behavior with COVID regulations. That's horrible. And there's a lot more coming. So on my program, I just really encourage people to speak out against this, because even though, it doesn't seem to be too much, the dollar's still working pretty good. But deep down inside, this country is a lot poorer. And I think that's the event. When people realize it and admit it, Maybe it'll be involved with unemployment or something else, or a war that people can't stand. But that is one of the biggest things that they should be concerned about, and that has been what has happened. You mentioned already $30 trillion, and that went up in the last couple years. That it went up so rapidly.
Well, a lot of this has caused interest in gold and in Bitcoin. I want to bring it back to the war in Ukraine, because Ukraine has passed a law that creates a legal framework for the cryptocurrency industry. Ukraine has received about $100 million in crypto donations, highlighting one of the benefits of cryptos and Bitcoin. Now, you and I have discussed Bitcoin before. You've said that Bitcoin should be allowed to compete with the dollar, but you cautioned that Bitcoin's greatest risk would be its success, and that the Federal Reserve is not going to like having its monopoly threatened, that it could be outlawed. Now, we are seeing growing institutional support for Bitcoin. It's generating more tax revenue. It's being cited as an asset class and permeating the financial system more and more. But do you still think that it's at risk of being banned or outright banned or outlawed?
Yeah, I do. Mainly because I am influenced a whole lot about history and the gold history, and my interest in the study of money and some of the principles that Austrian economics teaches about what the nature of money should be. But that doesn't sway me from arguing the case for those who know about crypto, understand it better than I do, that it should be obviously permitted. But people don't. A lot of people don't understand it. So I would be cautious. Even now, even just recently, there's more stuff, and I worried about it about 5 years ago or something. I was at a conference and somebody was very interested in regulations. And I thought, wow, I'm with a bunch of hardcore libertarians. Here we're going to have a new currency. It's going to be anonymous, and it's going to still at the same time be transparent. This is wonderful. But the transparency, the argument I heard in that early episode was, and they sort of threw the question at me because I had been in Congress. How do we get to the right people on the right committee to get it? Because we need the regulations written, because then we'll be credible. And that still goes on, credible asset, SEC, SEC report. But, the people who own gold and have been taught about survival, and you have gold coins, they're not looking for a way that the government knows where all your gold is just in case they want to take it in again. That's almost like asking, how many guns do you have, and tell us what safe are in there. They don't like that. So I'm surprised, but I understand why that helped crypto. But if you compare the peak price of crypto and compare compare that to the peak price of gold, it's an interesting finding. Who's done the best from the peaks? It's right now there's a question, but Bitcoin is unique. It's different. The markets are different, but it does. I've been trying to figure out, is it more like a stock or a bond or a hard asset commodity? Right now, I would say, looking at the different statistics, it seems to trace stock prices as well as anything else that I know.
Yeah, there does seem to be a correlation so far between tech stocks in particular, and Bitcoin and some of the other altcoins, to your point there. I want to sort of get your thoughts on some more foreign policy topics before we wrap up. President Biden is expected to have a call with China's President Xi Jinping on Friday. The White House says that they're going to address the Russia-Ukraine war and competition between China and the US, as well as other topics. There's concern that the Biden administration has signaled weakness with regards to the Afghanistan debacle and the way that it has perhaps let Russia come in and take this action in Ukraine. How do you think China is reading what's happening on the global stage at the moment?
Well, I guess my guess is as good as anybody's guess. Now, I think they're very vigilant and they're watching very carefully. They do sincerely believe that Taiwan is part of China, and the Taiwanese believe that not to be true. And there is going to be a fight over that one day. But I think, fortunately, right now, China acts, with a reasonable amount of restraint. Which I think is good. But I don't think we act with any restraint. We send our war vessels over there, and we get too close. We want to see how close we can get to the Chinese waters. So we have war vessels all over the South China Sea and all this. Also unnecessary. But China is keeping their eyes open, and I think eventually there's going to be some fighting over it.
Eventually, you do see China being emboldened and trying to instigate some kind of takeover of Taiwan.
Yeah, and I think it'll come when there's another distraction. Maybe those 100,000 troops we have in Europe now further surrounding Ukraine and badgering Russia. If that gets to be a real hot war, the Chinese might decide this might not be the worst time, to do this. Who's going to come and stop us? Or if everybody's in Europe fighting, maybe taking over Taiwan wouldn't be that difficult.
So I guess you're saying if this conflict escalates to the point that you do have U.S. troops on the ground militarily engaged in this, that would provide an opportune time for China to make a move on Taiwan if this conflict gets there.
Yeah, and I'm always, the troop business is very important, but I think thinking we're in the age in which we live, cyber war is something that I don't know the technology of all that stuff that goes on, but I think that whole concept where they can close down, electrical grids and do the things that they do, that is this whole thing that we as a nation, if we decide that we don't like Russia anymore, we can steal half of their reserve currencies just with a computer. That stuff that stirs up a lot of hatred. Whether that leads to the troops march, I don't know. But I think the cyber war is a real fear on my part because I don't understand how they do all those kind of things.
Yes, certainly cyber warfare is a big cause for concern, perhaps even more so given that than the nuclear warfare, given that it has, a much higher chance of happening. I want to ask you what advice you would give to President Biden, given that you yourself have run for president several times. What advice would you give President Biden right now?
See, that question invites me analyzing the situation, our relations with China, and what we think about Taiwan and Ukraine, and what technical what military advisor am I going to follow to do this? But mine is always philosophic and strategic. Should we be there, or should we just get out? And my argument is we don't need to be there. We don't have a right to be there. It's not moral to be there, and we can't do it. Besides, it's always a failure when people, overstretch their empires, and it's usually the foreign policy that brings them down. So my advice is start unwinding it. Don't send more troops over there and quit spending the money. Why punish the people here at home? The one thing that I preach, but I don't know if anybody listens, is that when a person goes to the store, and let's say, for instance, they've been paying $1 a loaf for bread, and all of a sudden the next day it was $2 a loaf, and they're yelling and screaming, "What are you going to do, Mr. President? Do this and this and this." Well, that extra dollar is a tax, because we spent the money that we don't have, $30 trillion, and we're going to print money up against that. So it's the tax. We don't tax people anymore. Nobody has enough money to give us $30 trillion. So we just print the money, the value of the money goes down, and the prices go up. But people don't understand that. So the people interpret that as, I don't have enough money to pay for the bread. Give me money. it's $2 now. It's your fault. And why did you do it? My advice to him is quit spending the money and balance the budget, whatever you can do. You have a veto pen, veto this stuff if you want to save the country. If you don't, because it's not an easy political thing to do. People are not, for them to, I made fun of it and it deserved to be made fun of. Look at what they went through to raise interest rates to 25 points. That is so silly that if you had the Fed or somebody else even moving in the directions, that's why I predicted when you asked me, or how far are they going to get with this unwinding, and are they going to raise the interest rates 5 times this year? I don't see how that's going to happen. I really don't. People are going to rebel. The financial markets will rebel. People will start rushing out and buying commodities more so than they have already. Gold is going to skyrocket. Even silver might go up finally.
All right. Gold and silver might go up, and we've already seen a big increase in a range of commodities, to your point. Dr. Paul, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your insight and analysis. Thank you again for joining us here on Kitco. Thank you.
Thank you. Great to be with you.